The letter fell from Eleanor's hand before she finished reading it, not because of what it said, but because of what it did not say. Her son Nathaniel, Duke of Ashcombe, had written only a single line about the woman he intended to marry. "Charlotte Bennet is everything I could wish for, Mother. You will see it when you meet her at the wedding." Eleanor read the line 3 times. A son does not need 3 words to describe a woman he loves. He needs pages. He needs stories about the way she laughs, the things she says when she thinks no one important is listening. Nathaniel had given her nothing but a title and a promise, and promises from young men in love were the easiest words in the world to write. She set the letter on her writing desk and looked out at the gray London morning. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks her only son would stand before a church full of witnesses and bind his life to a woman that Eleanor had met only twice, both times at crowded dinners where every guest wore their finest manners like armor. She had watched Charlotte Bennet smile at every joke, agree with every opinion, and compliment every dress in the room. It had all been perfect, too perfect. Eleanor had lived long enough at court to know that perfection performed for an audience meant nothing at all. The real test of a person was how they behaved when they believed no one of consequence was watching. She rang the small bell on her desk, and her lady's maid, a quiet woman named Alice who had served her for 9 years, stepped into the room. "Alice," Eleanor said, "how would a woman go about becoming a housemaid in someone else's home?" Alice blinked. "Your Grace?" "Not permanently. For a fortnight, perhaps less. I need to enter a household as a servant, and I need no one there to know who I truly am." Alice set down the tray she was carrying with great care, as though the china itself might object to what it had just heard. "Your Grace, if I may ask, whose household?" "The Bennet family. Charlotte Bennet is staying with her aunt in Surrey until the wedding. I intend to be there before she is." For a long moment Alice said nothing. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Why not simply visit her as yourself, Your Grace? You are the Duke's mother. No door in England would be closed to you." Eleanor stood and walked to the window. Below, a carriage rattled past on the wet stone street, and she watched it until it disappeared around the corner. "Because doors that open for a duchess are doors that close the truth away. When I visit as myself, I will be served tea in the finest parlor, and Charlotte will say every correct word, and I will learn nothing except that she knows how to behave in front of a duchess. Any clever girl can manage that for one afternoon. I want to see her when she believes there is nothing to gain and no one worth performing for. I want to see her with the servants. And if she is exactly as kind as she appears, then I will bless this marriage with a full heart and never speak of this to a living soul." Eleanor turned from the window. "But if she is not, Alice, then I intend to know it before my son gives her his name." Before she left the drawing room that morning, Eleanor sat for a while with an old portrait of her late husband, hung above the mantel since the day of his funeral. He had been a plain-spoken man for a duke, the kind who noticed when a footman's boots were worn through before anyone else in the house did, and who insisted every child born on the estate be given proper schooling whether their parents could afford it or not. He had taught Nathaniel that a title was not a shield against decency but a magnifier of it, that the more power a man held, the more carefully he was obligated to use it. Eleanor wondered, looking up at the painted face that had stopped aging the year he died, whether Nathaniel had chosen a wife who understood that lesson at all, or whether he had simply been dazzled the way young men so often were, by a clever smile and a graceful way of entering a room. She thought too of her own wedding, 40 years past now, and of the mother-in-law she had feared long before she ever met her. An intimidating woman, with a reputation for sharp judgment. That woman had watched Eleanor for exactly 1 season before pronouncing her worthy, and Eleanor had spent years afterward grateful that the judgment, however anxious it had made her at the time, had been made honestly rather than assumed. Perhaps, she thought, this was simply her turn to offer the same rigorous honesty to a young woman who did not yet know she was being tested. It took 4 days to arrange. Alice had a cousin who worked as a housekeeper's assistant in a house 2 villages from where the Bennets were staying, and through careful letters and quiet promises, a position was found. The Bennet household, it turned out, was in need of an extra housemaid for the weeks leading up to the wedding, since the aunt hosting Charlotte insisted on entertaining half the county before sending her niece off in marriage. A woman named Ellen Marsh, mild-mannered and unremarkable, would arrive to help with the linens and the fires and whatever else needed doing. Eleanor had never scrubbed a floor in her life. She had never carried water up 2 flights of stairs or blackened a grate before dawn, but she had watched her own servants do these things for 60 years, and she found, to her quiet satisfaction, that watching had taught her more than she expected. The morning she left London, she wore a plain wool dress the color of dead leaves, and she pulled her gray hair back into a knot so severe it made her look 10 years older. She left her rings in a locked drawer and took nothing that might mark her as anything other than what she claimed to be. Alice packed a small bag with 2 more plain dresses, a worn pair of boots, and nothing else. "You do not have to do this," Alice said at the carriage door, her voice low with worry. "There are other ways to learn the truth about a person." "Name one that would actually work." Alice had no answer, because there was none, so she simply nodded and stepped back, and the carriage rolled away, carrying a Duchess dressed as a maid, toward a house full of secrets she had not yet earned the right to hear. The Bennett house stood at the edge of a small village, a handsome stone building with ivy climbing one wall, and a garden that had clearly once been someone's great pride, before neglect crept in. Eleanor arrived at the servants' entrance in the back, as instructed, and was met by a stern woman named Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, who looked her up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had hired and dismissed more maids than she could count. "You're Ellen Marsh, then?" It was not really a question. "Yes, ma'am. You'll start in the linen room and work your way up as needed. Miss Bennett's wedding is in 3 weeks, and this house has never seen so much fuss in all its years. Mind you keep your head down and your hands busy, and we'll get along fine." Mrs. Dawson turned and began walking, clearly expecting to be followed. "The other girls will show you where things are kept. And Ellen, one more thing." "Yes, ma'am?" "Whatever you hear in this house, you keep to yourself. A servant with a loose tongue doesn't stay a servant long." Eleanor almost smiled at the irony of the warning, but she caught herself in time and simply nodded, following the housekeeper into the narrow servants' corridor that ran like a hidden vein beneath the grand rooms of the house. She was given a small bed in a room shared with 2 other maids, a girl named Grace who could not have been older than 17, and an older woman named Ruth who had worked in service for 30 years and complained about her knees at every opportunity. Neither of them looked at Eleanor twice. To them she was simply another pair of hands come to help before the wedding, one more face among the dozens that passed through great houses and left no mark behind. Grace showed her around that first afternoon, chattering easily as they walked the narrow corridors, pointing out which doors led where, which floorboards creaked loudly enough to wake the whole house, which pantry shelf held the good tea reserved only for guests of consequence. "You'll want to watch your step near the linen cupboard," Grace warned, lowering her voice, as though the cupboard itself might be listening. "Mrs. Dawson counts everything twice, and if a single pillowcase goes missing, she'll have the whole house turned upside down looking for it before supper." "I'll be careful," Eleanor promised, and found herself oddly charmed by the girl's earnestness, the easy way she offered friendship to a stranger without a second thought. Later, over a simple supper of bread and thin soup eaten standing in the kitchen because the family's own meal had run long and delayed the servant's hour, Ruth asked Eleanor where she had come from before this position. Eleanor had prepared an answer for exactly this question. A small village 2 counties over. A widowed mother she helped support. Nothing so detailed it might later be checked, and nothing so vague it might invite suspicion. Ruth accepted it without much interest, the way people in service learned not to pry too deeply into each other's pasts, since so many of those pasts held hardships nobody particularly wished to revisit at the end of a long working day. That first night, lying on a mattress far thinner than any she had slept on since childhood, Eleanor listened to the house settle around her. Somewhere above, in the finer rooms where the family slept, Charlotte Bennet was surely dreaming of her wedding day, of the Duke who loved her, of the life waiting on the other side of a church aisle. She had no idea that the woman who would one day be her mother by marriage was lying 2 floors below her, disguised in a servant's nightgown, listening to every sound the house made. Eleanor did not sleep well. Her back ached from the thin mattress, and her mind would not be still. She thought of Nathaniel as a boy, small and serious, always asking questions no other child thought to ask. She thought of his father, gone 8 years now, and what he would have said about a mother sneaking into a house dressed as a maid to judge their son's bride. He would have laughed, she decided. He would have called it exactly the sort of thing she would do, and then he would have told her she was right to do it. By morning, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but so had resolve. She rose before the sun, as the other maids did, and began the work of learning a house from its lowest rooms upward. She carried coal, she swept hearths, she learned the names of every servant below stairs within 2 days, because names were the first currency of trust, and trust was the only thing that would let her hear what she had come to hear. On the 3rd morning, Mrs. Dawson called her into the small office off the kitchen and told her she would be moved to help serve the family directly, since one of the regular maids had taken ill. Eleanor kept her face perfectly still, though inside her heart had begun to beat faster than it had in years. "You'll be assisting with Miss Bennet's morning routine starting tomorrow," Mrs. Dawson said, flipping through a ledger without looking up. "Mind your manners. She's soon to be a duchess herself, and she doesn't care for clumsy hands. I understand, ma'am. See that you do. Eleanor left the small office and walked back through the corridor, past the kitchen where Ruth was kneading dough and Grace was polishing silver with more energy than skill. She had come to this house with a single purpose, and by tomorrow morning, she would finally be close enough to see it fulfilled. Whatever truth waited behind Charlotte Bennet's practiced smile, Eleanor was about to be near enough to hear it for herself, and no rehearsed performance in the world could survive that kind of nearness for very long. Eleanor woke before the bell rang the next morning, her stomach tight with something she had not felt in decades, nerves. A duchess who had faced down gossiping courtiers and difficult ambassadors for 40 years, found herself nervous over the prospect of carrying a breakfast tray to a young woman half her age. She dressed in her plain gray uniform, the starched collar scratching at her neck, and made her way up the back stairs that servants used to move unseen through the house. Ruth walked beside her, explaining in a low voice what would be expected. Miss Bennet likes her tea strong, 2 sugars, no milk until it cools a little. She likes the curtains opened halfway, never all the way. She says full sun gives her headaches. And she likes to be greeted, not just served. Say good morning, ask if she slept well, that sort of thing. She notices when a girl forgets. She sounds particular, Eleanor said carefully. Ruth gave a small, tired laugh. They're all particular, love. Some are kind about it and some aren't. You'll learn which sort she is soon enough. Along the way, Ruth pointed out a young lady's maid named Hetty, hired specially from a London agency to help Charlotte dress for the wedding itself, though she would not begin her proper duties until the final week. Hetty gave Eleanor a brief, distracted nod as she hurried past with an armful of ribbon samples, clearly already worn thin by the demands of a household preparing for its biggest event in a generation. Don't mind her, Ruth murmured once Hetty had passed. She's not unkind, just run ragged. Miss Bennet keeps changing her mind about the wedding gown trim, and poor Hetty's the one who has to keep unpicking and re-sewing it every time. They reached the door of Charlotte's bedroom, and Ruth knocked twice before pushing it open. The room beyond was bright and elegant, full of trunks half-packed for the wedding, gowns draped over every chair, and in the center of it all, seated at a dressing table brushing her own dark hair, sat Charlotte Bennet. She was younger looking up close than Eleanor remembered from the dinners in London, with a round, pretty face and quick, clever eyes that moved over the 2 maids the moment they entered. You're late, she said, not looking up from the mirror. I rang 10 minutes ago. Sorry, miss, Ruth said quickly. We came as fast as we could. 10 minutes is not fast. Charlotte set down her brush with a sharp click against the table. This is the new girl? Yes, miss. Ellen. Charlotte turned then, and her eyes settled on Eleanor with an assessing coldness that vanished the instant Eleanor met her gaze, replaced so quickly by a warm, easy smile that Eleanor almost doubted what she had seen. Well, Ellen, welcome. I do hope you'll be quick on your feet. There's ever so much to do before the wedding, and I can't abide slowness. I'll do my best, miss, Eleanor said, keeping her eyes low, her voice soft. See that you do better than your best. The warmth did not leave Charlotte's face even as the words came out sharp as a slap, and Eleanor understood in that single moment exactly what Ruth had meant. The kindness and the cruelty lived side by side in this young woman, wearing the same pleasant expression, and a person who did not know to look for both would only ever see the one Charlotte wanted them to see. The morning routine continued, and Eleanor watched everything. She watched Charlotte praise a visiting cousin's dress to her face and then, the moment the cousin left the room, remarked to her aunt that the fabric looked cheap and the cut did nothing for her figure. She watched Charlotte thank Grace sweetly for pressing a gown, only to fling the same gown across the room minutes later because a single wrinkle remained near the hem, saying nothing more than a cold, "Do it again," without so much as a glance at the girl who scrambled to obey. None of it was violent. None of it was even, on its surface, unusual. Great houses were full of demanding mistresses, and servants learned to endure sharp words the way sailors learn to endure storms, simply a condition of the work. But Eleanor was not watching for ordinary sharpness. She was watching for a pattern, and by the end of the first day, the pattern had already begun to take shape. Charlotte Bennet was 2 different people, and she moved between them so effortlessly that she likely no longer noticed the switch herself. On the second morning, Eleanor was sent to help carry breakfast trays up from the kitchen, a task that placed her just outside the small dining room where the family took their morning meal. She heard Charlotte's voice through the half-open door, bright and animated, describing a bonnet she had seen in a shop window in terms so charming that even Mrs. Prescott laughed aloud at the description. It was, Eleanor thought, A genuinely funny observation, delivered with real wit, and she found herself unable to entirely dislike the woman making it, however troubling the contrast with what she had witnessed the day before. That same afternoon, a delivery boy arrived at the kitchen door with a crate of wedding china that had been ordered from London, and in his hurry to unload it before the rain began, he cracked one of the delicate cups against the doorframe. The boy went white with fear, certain he would lose whatever small payment he'd been promised for the delivery, perhaps more besides. Charlotte happened to be passing through the kitchen at that exact moment, checking on preparations for an afternoon tea, and Eleanor braced herself for the same coldness she had already witnessed toward Peter. Instead, Charlotte simply looked at the cracked cup, then at the terrified boy, and said, "Accidents happen in weather like this. Tell your master the crate arrived safely and the fault was the road, not you." She pressed a coin into his hand before he could argue, and sent him on his way with the crate rewrapped more carefully by her own hands. Eleanor watched the whole exchange from the doorway, and it did nothing to simplify the portrait forming in her mind, only complicated it further, another thread woven into a pattern she still could not fully read. That evening, in the narrow room she shared with Grace and Ruth, Eleanor asked carefully, "Has Miss Bennet always been so particular?" Grace, sitting on her bed unpinning her hair, gave a short laugh with no humor in it. "You should have seen her before the engagement. She was worse. Nothing pleased her. But since the Duke started courting her, she's been better, at least in front of company. It's like she knows she has to seem sweet now that a title's coming." Grace nodded along with everything Ruth said, twisting a lock of her own hair nervously around one finger, a habit Eleanor had noticed she fell into whenever a conversation made her uneasy. "It's not that she's cruel every day," Grace added quietly. "Some days she barely notices us at all, kind or unkind, just moves through the house like we're part of the furniture. It's the days she does notice that you learn to dread. And when there's no company?" Grace and Ruth exchanged a glance, the kind of glance that passed between people who had learned not to say too much even in private. It was Ruth who finally answered, "When there's no company, love, you'll see soon enough. Best keep your head down and your opinions to yourself. That's the safest way through it." Eleanor lay awake again that night, turning the day over in her mind. She thought of Nathaniel's letter, the single line about a woman who was everything he could wish for, and she wondered how much of Charlotte Bennet her son had truly seen. Courtship was its own performance after all, perhaps the grandest performance of a young woman's life, and if Charlotte could fool a house full of servants into silence, she could certainly fool a besotted duke who saw her only in her finest moments. The days that followed brought more of the same, small cruelties stacked one atop another, like stones building a wall Eleanor could not yet see the shape of. She watched Charlotte set two maids against each other by telling each privately that the other had spoken ill of her, watched the resulting coldness between two young women who had been friends only a week before. She watched Charlotte take credit, in front of her aunt, for a beautifully arranged flower display that Grace had spent an entire morning creating, accepting the praise with a modest little laugh as though she herself had cut every stem. And she listened. Servants below stairs learned to speak carefully around the family, but they spoke freely among themselves, and Eleanor, as a new and seemingly harmless face, was told more in 5 days than she might have learned in 5 months as a duchess taking tea in the parlor. She learned that Charlotte's family had once been far wealthier, before her father's poor investments left them with a fine name and a thin purse. She learned that Charlotte's aunt hosting her now had taken her in 3 years ago when her parents could no longer properly support 2 daughters in society, and that Charlotte had spent those 3 years watching her sister quietly slip out of eligible circles for lack of a dowry, while she herself clawed her way, gown by gown, invitation by invitation, into rooms where a duke might notice her. None of this excused cruelty. But it began, slowly, to color it differently in Eleanor's mind. A girl who had learned early that warmth was currency, and that losing favor meant losing everything, might learn to treat kindness as a performance rather than a feeling, might learn to see servants and rivals alike as obstacles or tools rather than people, simply because she had spent her whole young life being treated exactly that way by everyone above her own station. She learned more still from a conversation with Hetty, the harried lady's maid, who confided one evening while pinning up a hem, that Charlotte had once been quite different as a younger girl, before her family's fortunes collapsed. Hetty had a cousin who had briefly worked for the Bennet household years earlier, and according to that cousin, the young Charlotte had been soft-hearted to a fault, given to weeping over injured birds and giving away her own allowance to any beggar who asked. It was the collapse that changed her, my cousin always said, watching her father ruined, watching doors that used to open easy start closing in her face. She learned quick that softness didn't pay the bills, and hardness sometimes did. Eleanor turned this over carefully. If it was true, then whatever coldness lived in Charlotte now was not her original nature but a kind of armor built over it, and armor, unlike nature, could in theory be set down again, if the wearer ever found herself safe enough to try. On the fourth day, Eleanor was given the task of tidying the small library where Charlotte often sat writing correspondence, and she noticed, tucked half beneath a stack of wedding invitations, a folded piece of paper covered in Charlotte's careful hand, crossed out and rewritten several times over, as though the words had come with great difficulty. Eleanor did not read it, not fully, propriety and conscience both stopping her hand before it could unfold the paper further, but she caught enough of the visible lines to see the words, "Dearest sister, and I promise you will not be forgotten," written near the top, before she set it respectfully back beneath the invitations exactly as she had found it. By the fifth day, Eleanor had begun to feel the particular exhaustion that came from constant vigilance, the effort of watching everything, remembering everything, while also performing the physical labor of a housemaid's day well enough not to draw suspicion from Mrs. Dawson's sharp eye. Her shoulders ached from carrying water, her knuckles had cracked from cold water and coarse soap, and yet beneath the physical tiredness ran a current of purpose she had not felt in years, not since Nathaniel's own childhood illnesses had kept her pacing hallways through long nights, watching for any change in his breathing. She was, she realized with some surprise, more fully alive in this narrow servant's world than she had been in a great while, sitting comfortably in her own grand rooms in London. It was on the fifth evening, carrying a stack of folded linens down the back stairs, that Eleanor overheard something that stopped her cold in the narrow corridor. Charlotte's voice, unmistakable even muffled through a half-open door, speaking to her aunt in a tone Eleanor had not yet heard from her, low and stripped of all its practiced sweetness. "I don't care what he thinks he loves about me, Aunt. He loves an idea. He's never once asked what I actually want, only assumed I want exactly what he's offering, a title, a house, a name, as if that's the whole of a woman's wanting." Eleanor's arms tightened around the linens in her hands. This was not the cruelty of small slights against servants. This was something else entirely, a crack running beneath the surface of the marriage itself, and it demanded to be heard in full before Eleanor could understand what she had truly found. Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor, the stack of linens pressed against her chest like a shield, and forced herself to breathe silently. The door to the small sitting room was open only a hand's width, but the gap was enough. Through it she could see a sliver of the room, Charlotte seated by the window with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her aunt, a stout woman named Mrs. Prescott, sitting across from her with an expression of weary patience. "You are marrying a duke," Mrs. Prescott said. "Do you have any idea what that means for this family, for your sister, for your mother, who has not slept easy in years worrying over how we would manage?" "I know exactly what it means," Charlotte said. "I have known it since the first evening he asked to call on me. I have smiled at every one of his friends, praised every one of his opinions, laughed at jokes that were not funny, and worn gowns I could not truly afford, so that I would look the part before I had even won it. Do not tell me I don't understand what this marriage means, Aunt." "I understand it better than anyone. Then why does your voice sound like this is a punishment and not a triumph?" There was a long pause before Charlotte answered, and when she did, her voice had dropped lower still, so that Eleanor had to lean nearer the gap in the door to catch the words. "Because sometimes, late at night, I wonder if he would still want me if I had nothing to offer him but myself. No name worth borrowing, no face that photographs well beside his, nothing but whatever is actually inside me, and I don't know the answer, Aunt. I don't know if I even know the answer, because I've spent 3 years becoming whatever each room needed me to be, and I've nearly forgotten what was there before I started." Eleanor's chest tightened in a way she had not expected. This was not the voice of a calculating young woman scheming her way into a title. This was something rawer, something that sounded almost like grief. "I have watched him look at me across a crowded room," Charlotte continued, before her aunt could interrupt further, "and I have wondered whether he is truly seeing me, or simply seeing the version of me I have spent 3 years perfecting." The graceful curtsy, the clever remark timed exactly right, the dress chosen precisely to flatter without ever appearing to try too hard. "I built that woman piece by piece, Aunt, the way a mason builds a wall, and I am not always certain anymore where the wall ends and I begin." "Every young woman entering society builds something similar," Mrs. Prescott said, her tone gentler now. "It is not deception, Charlotte. It is simply how the world is survived by people without fortunes large enough to survive it honestly. Perhaps. But a wall built to keep the world out does not always know how to let one person in, even a person you love." Charlotte's voice caught slightly on the word love, and she pressed on before her aunt could comment on it. "I do love him, Aunt. That much I am certain of. But I am less certain he loves the woman underneath the wall, because I am not entirely certain he has ever met her. That is enough of that talk, Mrs. Prescott said briskly, though not unkindly. Every woman wonders such things before her wedding. It means nothing. You will make him a fine wife, and in time the wondering will stop. Will it? Or will I simply stop noticing that I'm still wondering? Mrs. Prescott did not answer that question, and after a moment, Eleanor heard the creak of a chair and understood the conversation was ending. She moved quickly and quietly away from the door, down the corridor and around the corner, her heart pounding harder than the effort of the walk should have caused. She did not sleep that night either. She lay in the narrow bed, turning the overheard words over and over, trying to fit them against everything else she had witnessed. The cold command to redo a pressed gown, the credit stolen for another girl's work, the quiet cruelty toward the servants who could not answer back, and now this, a private confession of fear so honest it had nearly cracked her own composure to hear it. Both things were true, Eleanor realized slowly. A person could be unkind out of habit and still be frightened underneath the habit. A person could treat servants as tools and still genuinely wonder, in her most private moments, whether she was loved for herself or for what she represented. The two truths did not cancel each other out. They simply sat together, uncomfortable and unresolved, exactly the way most human truths tended to. She thought again of Nathaniel's letter, the single confident line describing a woman who was everything he could wish for, and she felt for the first time a flicker of worry not for her son's safety, but for his understanding. He believed he knew Charlotte fully, believed the wall Charlotte had built was simply the whole of her, rather than a defense constructed over something more fragile beneath it. If Eleanor said nothing, if she simply returned to London and let the wedding proceed as planned, Nathaniel would marry a woman he had only half met, and Charlotte would spend the rest of her life uncertain whether the man beside her loved her or merely loved the performance she had perfected for his benefit. Neither outcome sat easily with Eleanor, and she began to understand, lying awake in the narrow servant's bed, that her task in this house was growing larger than simple observation. She was not merely gathering evidence to approve or reject a marriage. She was, whether she had intended it or not, becoming the one person positioned to see both halves of Charlotte Bennet clearly enough to eventually help join them back together, if such a thing were even possible. The next morning brought no relief, only more of the same troubling mixture. Eleanor watched Charlotte snap at Grace over a misplaced hairpin, then, not 10 minutes later, watched her quietly slip a coin into the pocket of an elderly gardener, who had been let go from another household and come begging at the kitchen door, doing it so discreetly that she clearly expected no one to see and no thanks to follow. She does that sometimes, Ruth murmured to Eleanor later, when they were alone folding linens in the laundry room. Gives to the ones who ask, quiet-like, when she thinks no one's watching. Strange girl, sharp as a blade to us most days, then soft as anything to a stranger at the door who's got nothing at all. Why do you think that is? Ruth shrugged, her hands never pausing in their folding. My guess, love, is that she can't afford to be soft with us. We're beneath her now, in her mind, or she's told herself we are, because if she isn't above someone, she's still that girl whose family nearly lost everything, still one bad season away from being back where she started. But a beggar at the door, he's no threat to her standing. Costs her nothing to be kind there. Costs her a great deal, in her own head at least, to be kind here. Eleanor said nothing, but she filed the observation away carefully. It was, she thought, a remarkably clear-eyed piece of wisdom from a woman who had spent 30 years watching gentry from the shadows of their own houses, and it matched precisely what Eleanor herself had begun to suspect. 30 years is a long time to watch families up close, Eleanor said, choosing her words carefully. Have you known many like her, sharp in the house, soft outside it? Ruth considered the question seriously, her hands still moving through the folded linens without pause, the motion so practiced it required no thought at all. A few. Not many turn out well, if I'm honest. Most just get harder as the years go on, until the softness outside the house shrinks smaller and smaller, and one day it's gone entirely, and there's nothing left but the sharpness, wherever they happen to be standing. She glanced sideways at Eleanor, but I've known one or two who found their way out of it. Usually because somebody caught them at it, the sharpness I mean. Caught them plainly enough that they couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore, and cared enough to say so without walking away afterward. That's rarer. Most people either flatter the gentry or avoid them. Not many bother telling them the truth to their face. Eleanor said nothing more that evening, but the words stayed with her long after the lamp had been extinguished, turning over and over in the dark like a coin flipped by an unseen hand. The following morning brought the incident with the gardener that Ruth had mentioned days before actually occurring, an elderly man named Foss who arrived at the kitchen door with his cap in his weathered hands, asking only whether there might be an hour or two of work sweeping the paths before the wedding guests arrived. He had been let go from his previous position, he explained to Mrs. Dawson without self-pity, simply because the new owners of the estate wished to bring in younger help. Mrs. Dawson had no work to spare and said so plainly, and the old man nodded and turned to leave with the quiet resignation of someone long accustomed to disappointment. It was Charlotte who intercepted him at the garden gate, walking alone in the cool morning air before the household properly woke, and Eleanor, polishing the hall windows nearby, watched the exchange through the glass. She could not hear the words, but she watched Charlotte speak to the old man for several minutes, watched her press something into his hand, watched his face crease into an expression of surprised gratitude before he bowed and shuffled away down the lane. When Charlotte turned back toward the house, her face had already rearranged itself into its usual composed mildness. No trace of the warmth she had just shown a moment before, as though the kindness itself needed to be folded away and hidden the instant it was no longer needed. The wedding drew closer, and the household grew busier still, seamstresses coming and going, invitations being finalized, the aunt's parlor filling with wedding gifts arriving early from families eager to secure favor with a future duchess. Eleanor found herself pulled into every corner of the preparations, and with each day she spent closer to Charlotte, the portrait in her mind grew more complicated rather than simpler. She watched Charlotte write a long, careful letter to her sister, the one who had quietly dropped out of eligible society for lack of a dowry, promising that once she was married, she would see to it that her sister had a proper season, proper gowns, proper introductions, whatever it took to give her the chances Charlotte herself had fought so hard to claim. The letter was full of genuine warmth, the kind that could not easily be performed for an audience of one sealed envelope with no one else to witness the writing of it. And then, that same afternoon, she watched Charlotte dismiss a young footman on the spot for arriving 4 minutes late to carry a trunk down the stairs, with no warning, and no chance to explain that his delay had come from helping an injured stable boy back to his quarters. The footman's name was Peter, and he was 17, and Eleanor watched his face crumple with the particular shame of a boy trying not to cry in front of people he worked beside. "Please, miss," he had said. "I was only helping Danny. He'd twisted his ankle something terrible in the yard. I didn't think a few minutes would matter so much." "It matters that you did not ask permission," Charlotte had answered, cold and final. "Mrs. Dawson will settle your wages. You may go." Eleanor had stood in the corner of the hall, arms full of folded curtains, and watched a boy's livelihood vanish over 4 minutes, and a kindness he had shown to another servant, and she had felt something harden in her chest that all the earlier softness toward Charlotte could not fully undo. Whatever fear and history lived beneath Charlotte Bennet's cruelty, it did not erase the cruelty itself, or the real harm it caused to people who had no power to answer back. Peter gathered his few belongings that same afternoon, a small bundle wrapped in cloth that seemed impossibly light for the sum of a young man's whole life. Grace cried quietly in the kitchen as he said his goodbyes, and even Ruth, who had seen dozens of servants come and go over her 30 years, wiped at her eyes with the corner of her apron, and pressed a small parcel of food into his hands for the road. "You'll find another position, love," she told him, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "A good worker like you doesn't stay unplaced for long." "I hope you're right," Peter said, and Eleanor, watching from the doorway, saw a boy trying very hard to sound braver than he felt, the way young men so often did, when the alternative was letting others see how frightened they truly were. He left through the servants' gate without looking back at the grand house he had served faithfully for 2 years, and Eleanor found herself thinking, with a bitterness that surprised her, that titles and grand houses meant very little if the people living inside them could discard a good young man so easily over so small a thing. That night Eleanor barely touched her supper. Grace noticed and asked if she was unwell, and Eleanor said only that she was tired, which was true enough, though the tiredness was not the kind that sleep could fix. She thought of Nathaniel again, of the boy who had once cried for an entire afternoon because he'd accidentally stepped on a beetle in the garden and could not forgive himself for it. He had grown into a man who noticed small cruelties and could not abide them, who had once dismissed an entire hunting party as guests from his own estate because one of the men had struck a servant's horse in a fit of temper. If Nathaniel ever learned that his bride had dismissed a good boy over 4 innocent minutes, what would he do? Eleanor did not yet know the answer. But she understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her stomach, that she had not yet seen the whole of Charlotte Bennet, not the fear beneath the coldness, not the coldness beneath the fear, and that whatever final truth waited to be uncovered, it was going to demand more of her than quiet observation from the shadows of the household. She spent the following morning composing, in her mind, the letter she might send to Peter's family once this masquerade was finished, an offer of a position on the Ashcombe estate itself, where Nathaniel's own steward could always use another steady pair of hands, and where no dismissal would ever again hinge on 4 innocent minutes spent helping an injured friend. It would not undo what had happened, but it would at least ensure the boy's future did not remain broken by a single afternoon's misjudgment, and Eleanor found some small comfort in having at least that much power to set right. But Peter's fate, however troubling, was not the whole of what had drawn her to this house, and she knew it. The larger question remained unanswered, whether the young woman her son intended to marry was capable of becoming someone other than the frightened, guarded creature her upbringing had shaped her into, or whether that shaping was already too complete, too deeply set, to be undone by anything as simple as being truly seen. Sooner or later, something would have to bring the two of them face to face, servant and mistress, without the safety of distance between them, and Eleanor suspected that day was coming faster than she was ready for. The day it happened began like any other, which was, Eleanor had come to learn, exactly how the worst days always began. She was in the sewing room mending a torn hem on one of Charlotte's traveling gowns, a task Mrs. Dawson had assigned her because her stitches, unknown to anyone in the house, were the product of 60 years spent perfecting fine needlework as a lady of leisure. It was almost funny, she thought, that the skill she had learned for embroidery hoops and decorative cushions was now the very thing keeping her disguise convincing. The morning had begun ordinarily enough. Eleanor had risen with the other maids before dawn, helped lay the fires in the lower rooms, and carried a basket of mending up to the sewing room where the light was best for close work. She had spent an hour repairing a torn seam on one of the wedding guests' borrowed shawls, her mind wandering, as it often did now, to Nathaniel, and to what she would eventually say to him once her time in this house came to its end. She had not yet decided how much to tell him, or how. The thought of it sat heavy in her chest even on quiet mornings when nothing else demanded her attention. Grace burst into the room without knocking, her face pale. "Ellen, you're wanted upstairs. Miss Bennet's asked for you directly, not Ruth, you." Eleanor set down her needle carefully. In 5 days, Charlotte had never once asked for her by name. Did she say why? No, only that she wants you now, and you know how she gets when she's kept waiting. Eleanor climbed the back stairs with her heart beating faster than the climb warranted, running through every possible reason Charlotte might have singled her out. Had she been seen doing something wrong? Had someone below stairs let slip a careless word about the new girl asking too many questions? By the time she reached the bedroom door, her palms had gone damp inside her rough servant's gloves. Charlotte was standing at the window when Eleanor entered, her back turned, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet in a way Eleanor had not heard from her before. None of the sharpness, none of the practiced warmth either. "You're new here, Ellen." "Yes, miss." "You haven't got the habits the other girls have. The way they flinch before I've even finished a sentence, the way they agree with everything before they've properly heard it. You listen first, I've noticed." Eleanor kept her eyes lowered, her voice even. "I try to do my work well, miss, that's all." Charlotte turned from the window then, and her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from crying or simple exhaustion, Eleanor could not tell. "I dismissed a footman yesterday. Peter, did you hear about that?" "I heard, miss. Everyone thinks I'm cruel for it. I could see it on every face in this house today, the way they look at me now, like I'm something to be managed rather than served." Charlotte sat down heavily on the edge of her bed, all the careful posture of a future duchess draining out of her at once. "Do you know what happens to a woman in my position who is seen as soft, Ellen? Do you know what happens when servants believe they can be 4 minutes late, 10 minutes late, whenever they please, because the new Duchess doesn't have the stomach to enforce a single rule? I couldn't say, miss. They stop respecting you. And a Duchess without respect is nothing at all, whatever her title says. My own mother taught me that before I was 12 years old. She said a woman's kindness is the first thing people will use against her. So guard it carefully, spend it rarely, and never let anyone see you spend it on someone who cannot repay you." Eleanor's hands, folded in front of her, tightened slightly. Here it was, laid bare without an audience worth performing for. The philosophy that had shaped every cruel and calculated choice she had witnessed all week. Not simple meanness, but a doctrine, taught mother to daughter, that kindness itself was a currency too precious to spend on anyone beneath you. "My mother was not a cruel woman, understand," Charlotte went on, as though needing to defend the very lesson she was in the midst of confessing. "She simply understood the world as it truly was, rather than as we all wish it to be. She watched my father's fortune collapse in the space of 2 bad years. watched friends who had dined at our table for a decade stop returning our calls entirely the moment our money thinned. She learned, and taught me, that affection tied to your circumstances is not affection at all, merely convenience wearing a friendly face. Guard your kindness, she told me, because kindness given freely to people who have nothing to lose by taking it from you will always, eventually, be taken. That sounds a hard way to live, miss, if you don't mind my saying. Charlotte looked up sharply, and for a moment, Eleanor feared she had overstepped badly enough to end her disguise on the spot. But instead of anger, something else crossed Charlotte's face, something almost like relief at being challenged, however gently, by someone with nothing to gain from flattering her. It is a hard way to live, Charlotte said slowly. Harder than anyone who's never had to live it could understand. Do you know what it is to smile at people who look at your family like we're something to be pitied? To watch your own sister give up every hope of a good match because there wasn't money enough for 2 dowries, and know that the only thing standing between you and the same fate is how well you can perform in a drawing room. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and she pressed her lips together, visibly fighting to recover her composure. No, miss, I don't know that. No, of course you don't. Charlotte stood again, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled just slightly. Forget I said any of it. It isn't a servant's place to hear such things, and it certainly isn't mine to say them to one. The coldness returned to her voice like a door swinging shut, but Eleanor had already seen through the gap before it closed, and she knew she would not be able to unsee it. Will that be all, miss? Yes. No, wait. Charlotte hesitated, and something vulnerable flickered across her face one last time before she mastered it. The Duke arrives tomorrow, to see the final wedding arrangements with my aunt. I want the blue guest room prepared perfectly. He notices small things. He always has. Eleanor's stomach dropped. Nathaniel, arriving tomorrow, here, in this very house, where his own mother stood before his bride disguised as a maid. If he saw her, even for a moment, everything would unravel in an instant, and there would be no gentle way to explain why a duchess had spent a week scrubbing floors and mending hems under a false name. I'll see to it myself, miss, Eleanor said, and left the room as quickly as propriety allowed, her mind already racing through the impossible arithmetic of how to remain in this house long enough to learn the truth, while somehow staying entirely invisible to the one person in England who would recognize her face in an instant. The rest of that day passed in a blur of nervous energy. Eleanor found herself unable to settle into any task properly, her hands going through the motions of folding and sweeping while her mind raced ahead to the following morning, running through every possible arrangement of rooms and corridors, trying to calculate exactly where a duke's carriage might stop, which doors he might pass through, whether the kitchen entrance where she spent most of her hours lay anywhere near his expected path. She had faced difficult situations before in her long life, difficult births, a husband's sudden illness, the delicate politics of court gatherings, where a single misplaced word could wound a friendship for years, but she could not recall the last time her heart had hammered quite so persistently, as it did now, over the simple, absurd danger of being recognized by her own son. That evening she found Mrs. Dawson in the small office and asked, as casually as she could manage, whether the new girls would be needed for the Duke's visit or whether they might be spared for other duties instead. Mrs. Dawson gave her a curious look. Nervous about serving a duke, are you? No shame in that. Plenty of girls get flustered their first time near real gentry. But no, the regular staff will handle his visit, the ones who've served proper company before. You and Grace will keep to the kitchen and the linen work tomorrow, out of his way entirely. Relief washed through Eleanor so strongly she had to grip the doorframe for a moment to steady herself. She thought, briefly, of what might have happened had the answer gone the other way, of standing in a hallway with a tray in her hands while her own son passed within arm's reach of her, without the faintest suspicion that the tired-looking housemaid at the edge of his vision was his own mother. It would have taken only the smallest slip, a familiar gesture, a turn of phrase she had used with him since childhood, to unravel everything she had built over the past 10 days, and possibly to unravel a good deal more besides, since a duchess discovered in disguise inside her future daughter-in-law's household would give the London gossips material enough to last a decade. Thank you, ma'am, I appreciate it. Don't thank me, just do your work and stay useful. That's thanks enough for me. Mrs. Dawson returned to her ledger, and Eleanor slipped away, her heart still hammering from the closeness of a danger she had not fully appreciated until it was nearly upon her. She spent the rest of the evening planning her movements for the following day with the same careful attention she had once given to seating arrangements at state dinners, mapping out which corridors to avoid, which hours would find her safely occupied in the kitchen where no duke would ever think to wander, which excuses she might offer if, by some terrible misfortune, she found herself caught in a hallway with nowhere left to hide. Grace, sensing her roommate's unusual quiet that evening, asked gently whether something troubled her, and Eleanor, unable to explain the true source of her anxiety, simply said she was worried about performing well enough not to embarrass the household during such an important visit. Grace laughed at that, a warm, easy sound. "You needn't worry over that, Ellen. You'll be tucked away in the kitchen same as me, miles from any Duke's notice. Now if it were Ruth serving him his tea directly, that I might worry over, given how her hands shake something terrible when she's nervous." The small joke eased some of the tension from the room, and Eleanor managed something close to a genuine laugh in response, grateful for a moment of ordinary warmth amid the extraordinary tangle her errand had become. Lying in bed that night, she thought of Charlotte's face when she'd spoken of her mother's teaching. Guard your kindness, spend it rarely. It was not an excuse for cruelty, Eleanor told herself firmly. Peter had still lost his position over 4 innocent minutes, and no philosophy about guarded kindness could give him back his wages or his dignity. But it was, perhaps, an explanation, and explanations mattered, because they told a person whether what they were looking at could still change, or whether it was simply fixed and finished, a stone wall with no door in it at all. Eleanor did not yet know which one Charlotte Bennet was, but tomorrow, with Nathaniel's visit passing safely by, she would have only a handful of days left before the wedding, and she understood now that the truth she had come seeking was not going to arrive as a single clean answer. It was going to arrive in pieces, contradictory and difficult, and she would have to decide for herself what to do with all of it before her time in this house ran out. She thought, too, of the strange intimacy that had grown between herself and Charlotte in that brief conversation, the way a young woman on the edge of the greatest change of her life had chosen, however briefly, to speak honestly to a housemaid, rather than to any of the family or friends surrounding her. Perhaps that was the loneliest part of Charlotte's situation, Eleanor thought. She was surrounded by people invested in her success, her aunt, her mother, soon an entire ducal household, and not one of them could be trusted with the truth of her fears, because every one of them had something to gain or lose by how she carried herself into that marriage. Only a servant with nothing at stake, a woman she believed she would likely never see again after the wedding, had seemed safe enough to hear the truth at all. It was a small, sad irony that Eleanor turned over carefully as she made her way back down to the kitchen, one more thread in a pattern that grew more tangled the longer she stayed inside it. Nathaniel's visit passed without incident, though Eleanor spent the entire day in the kitchen with her back deliberately turned to every window, scrubbing pots that did not need scrubbing simply to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering toward the sound of his voice carrying faintly from the front rooms. Mrs. Finch, the cook, remarked more than once that she had never seen a girl take to pot scrubbing with quite such devotion, and Eleanor forced a small laugh and claimed she simply preferred keeping busy to standing idle, which was true enough, even if the reason behind it remained carefully hidden. Twice that morning she heard footsteps approaching the kitchen corridor and froze mid-motion, certain each time that Nathaniel had somehow wandered below stairs, only to discover it was merely Grace, or one of the footmen passing through on ordinary business. By midday her nerves had worn thin enough that Ruth noticed and asked, not unkindly, whether she was coming down with something, since her face had gone rather pale. Eleanor claimed the heat of the kitchen fires had simply gotten to her, and Ruth, satisfied, sent her to fetch water from the well outside, a task that conveniently kept her well away from the house for a quarter of an hour, while Nathaniel's carriage stood in the front drive. She heard him laugh once, warm and easy, and something in her chest ached at how long it had been since she'd heard that particular laugh in person rather than remembered it. He left by evening, and the household exhaled as one, the frantic energy of preparing for a duke's approval settling back into the ordinary business of preparing for a wedding. Eleanor allowed herself to believe, for a day and a half, that the worst danger of discovery had passed. She was wrong. It happened on a quiet afternoon, 3 days before the wedding, when Eleanor was sent to deliver a stack of freshly pressed linens to Charlotte's room. She knocked, heard no answer, and let herself in, as she had been instructed to do when a room was meant to be empty at that hour. But the room was not empty. Charlotte sat at her dressing table, not preparing herself for company, but simply staring at her own reflection, with an expression of such profound unhappiness that Eleanor nearly turned and left without a word. The room itself told its own quiet story that afternoon. The wedding gown, nearly finished now, hung on a stand near the window, its fine embroidery catching the gray afternoon light, and beside it sat a small stack of letters that had clearly been read and reread many times, their edges softened with handling. Eleanor's eyes caught, before she could stop herself, on a folded page bearing her own son's handwriting, and she looked away quickly, ashamed at how easily old instincts, the instincts of a mother curious about anything concerning her child, nearly overrode the caution she had maintained so carefully for 10 days. Before she could retreat, Charlotte's eyes lifted and met hers in the mirror. "Ellen, I didn't hear you knock." "I did knock, miss. I'm sorry. I'll come back later." "No, stay." Charlotte turned on the small stool to face her directly, and there was something different in her posture now, something stripped down and unguarded that Eleanor had only glimpsed once before, in the conversation about her mother's teachings. "You've been here, what, 10 days now?" "About that, miss." "In 10 days you've said perhaps 20 words to me, and yet somehow I find myself wanting to say things to you that I haven't said to anyone else in this house. Isn't that strange?" It was not quite a question. Charlotte looked down at her own hands, folded in her lap. "Do you think I'm a good person, Ellen?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor felt every ripple of it. There was no safe answer for a maid to give, and yet the truth demanded to be spoken, if only because Charlotte had asked it with such raw, unguarded need. "I think, miss, that I've seen you be very unkind to people who couldn't answer you back, and I've also seen you be kind to people who could never repay you for it. I don't rightly know what that makes a person, only that it's not one simple thing." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly. Whether at the honesty or the fact that a maid had dared to speak so plainly, Eleanor could not tell. For a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Peter," Charlotte finally said. "The footman. You're thinking of him." "Among others, miss, yes. I've thought of him every day since I dismissed him. I keep telling myself he broke a rule and rules matter, that a household without discipline falls apart, that my own mother would have done the same and worse in my position. But none of that makes the thought of his face any easier to carry around." Charlotte's voice thickened, and she pressed the back of her hand briefly against her mouth before continuing. "I could write him a reference, a good one, enough that another house would take him without question. I could do that tomorrow, and it would cost me nothing but a little pride. That sounds like a fine thing to do, miss, if you don't mind my saying so." "Why haven't I done it yet, then?" Charlotte asked, and the question seemed genuinely aimed at herself rather than at Eleanor. "Why do I sit here 3 days before my wedding, thinking about a footman's reference letter and unable to make myself write it?" She rose from the dressing table and crossed to the window, looking out over the garden where the last of the autumn roses still clung stubbornly to their stems. "I keep thinking of my mother's face, if she knew I meant to write it. She would say I was undoing my own authority, teaching every servant in this house that a dismissal can simply be undone if the dismissed party waits long enough for guilt to set in. She would say a duchess cannot afford such softness, that the whole structure of a great house depends on servants believing consequences are final." Charlotte's hand pressed flat against the cold glass. "And some nights I believe her completely, and other nights, like tonight, I think she was simply a frightened woman who never had the chance to learn any better. And I am about to become exactly the same kind of frightened, unless I choose differently while I still can." Eleanor considered her words carefully before she spoke, aware that whatever she said next might shape something important, though she could not have said exactly what. "Perhaps, miss, because writing it would mean admitting you were wrong to dismiss him in the first place. And it's a hard thing, admitting you were wrong, especially for someone who's spent her whole life being told that any softness will be used against her." Charlotte stared at her for a long moment, and something in her face cracked open, not into tears exactly, but into something rawer than Eleanor had yet witnessed. "Who are you really, Ellen? You don't talk like the other girls. You don't move like them either, if I'm honest, though I couldn't say quite what's different." Eleanor's heart stopped for one long, terrible beat. This was the moment, she realized, the one she had feared since arriving in this house, the crack in her disguise widening under nothing more than a young woman's grief-sharpened perception. "I've had a hard life too, miss, in my own way. Perhaps it shows more than I'd like." It was not quite a lie, and it seemed to satisfy Charlotte, or at least to close the door on further questions for the moment, because she looked away, back toward her own reflection in the mirror, and said nothing more about it. "I don't want to be the kind of duchess who makes people afraid of 4 minutes," she said instead, so quietly Eleanor nearly missed it. "I don't want to become my mother, but I don't know how to be anything else and still survive in the world I'm about to marry into. Nathaniel's world doesn't forgive weakness either, whatever kindness he shows me now while he's still courting me. Begging your pardon, miss, but has the Duke ever asked you to be hard, or has that only ever been something you decided you needed to be, all on your own?" Charlotte's head turned sharply, and for a moment Eleanor feared she had gone too far, spoken with a boldness no housemaid would risk. But instead of anger, Charlotte's expression softened into something almost like wonder, as though the question had never once occurred to her in all her careful calculating. "No," she said slowly. "He's never asked that of me. Not once." She said it again, quieter, almost to herself, as though testing the truth of it now that it had been spoken aloud. "I think I assumed it of him, without ever actually checking whether it was true. I built an entire version of my future husband out of my mother's fears, rather than out of anything Nathaniel himself has ever actually said or done. That seems, now that I hear myself say it, rather a foolish way to have spent 3 years. Begging your pardon again, miss, but it doesn't sound foolish to me. It sounds like a person doing the best she could with the only teaching she'd ever been given. Foolish would be knowing better and choosing wrong anyway. This sounds more like not knowing better yet, which is a different thing entirely, and easier to mend." One at herself. Charlotte looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. And for the second time that afternoon, Eleanor feared she had spoken with far more familiarity than any housemaid ought to risk. But Charlotte only nodded slowly, as if turning the words over, and finding some comfort in them despite herself. The door opened before either of them could say anything further, and Mrs. Prescott swept in with a bundle of wedding correspondence in her arms, breaking the moment as thoroughly as if it had been struck by lightning. Eleanor used the interruption to slip quietly from the room, her pressed linens delivered, her heart pounding with everything she had just heard and everything it might mean. She did not sleep that night, turning the conversation over from every angle. She had come to this house believing she would find one simple truth: a young woman either worthy of her son or not, and instead she had found something far messier, a person shaped by fear into habits she herself did not seem to like, standing at the edge of a marriage that might either save her from those habits or cement them permanently into place, depending entirely on which version of herself she chose to become. The next morning, word moved through the servants' quarters before breakfast was even finished, carried first by Hetty, and repeated in astonished whispers by nearly everyone below stairs. Miss Bennet had written a reference letter for Peter after all, a glowing one by every account, sealed and sent by the earliest post to the address Mrs. Dawson kept on file for departed staff. She had done it herself, at her own writing desk, without being asked twice by anyone, and had told no one why, only instructed that it be sent immediately and without comment. Grace could hardly contain her surprise over the kitchen table. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, buttering a heel of bread with more enthusiasm than the task strictly required. She dismissed him without so much as a backward glance, and now this. "What do you suppose changed her mind?" "Perhaps she simply thought better of it," Ruth said, though her tone carried a note of genuine wonder, rather than her usual weary skepticism. "People do sometimes, given enough time to sit with a decision." Eleanor said nothing, keeping her eyes on her own plate, though her chest had gone warm and tight with something close to pride, an odd feeling to hold for a young woman she had only known a fortnight, and stranger still to hold in secret, unable to claim any part in it aloud. She thought of the conversation in Charlotte's room the evening before, the trembling honesty of it, and understood now that something in Charlotte had indeed shifted, however small, however uncertain it might yet prove to be in the weeks ahead. Mrs. Prescott, it turned out, noticed the change as well, and was not entirely pleased by it. Eleanor overheard the two of them later that same day, passing the small sitting room where Charlotte sat with a length of unfinished needlework in her lap, her aunt standing over her with obvious concern etched into her features. "You wrote to that footman," Mrs. Prescott said, not quite a question. "The whole house is talking of nothing else." "I did. May I ask why, after everything I told you about maintaining proper authority in your own household?" Charlotte set down her needlework and met her aunt's eyes with a steadiness Eleanor had not seen in her before. "Because I was wrong to dismiss him, Aunt, and being wrong does not stop being wrong, simply because admitting it feels difficult. I would rather be a duchess who corrects her mistakes than one who protects her pride at the cost of another person's future." Mrs. Prescott studied her niece for a long moment, and something in her expression softened, reluctantly, into something almost like respect. "Your mother would not approve. My mother is not the one who has to live inside this decision for the rest of her life. I am." Charlotte picked her needlework back up, and the conversation, evidently, was finished, though Eleanor noted the particular firmness in her voice, a firmness that had nothing of the old brittle coldness in it, and everything instead of a woman finding, perhaps for the first time, solid ground beneath her own convictions rather than borrowed ones. She thought of the folded letter to Charlotte's sister she had glimpsed days before, the genuine warmth of it, and set it now beside this new fragile honesty, and beside the coin given quietly to a beggar, and beside the cracked teacup forgiven without a second thought, and weighed all of it against Peter's dismissal, and the flowers claimed as her own, and the small daily cruelties visited on servants who could not answer back. The scale did not tip cleanly in either direction. It simply sat there, balanced and trembling, exactly as uncertain as the young woman who had created it, though it had, Eleanor thought, begun very slightly to tip toward hope. Eleanor spent the walk back to the servants' quarters turning over what she had witnessed, aware that something had shifted in the room behind her, some small and fragile thing that might grow into real change, or might simply wither the moment the pressures of the wedding and the watching world closed back around Charlotte again. She could not know which outcome awaited. She only knew that she had seen, with her own eyes and ears, enough of both halves of Charlotte Bennet to no longer trust a simple verdict, guilty or innocent, worthy or unworthy, of the sort she had half expected to deliver when she first climbed into that servant's disguise a fortnight ago. The wedding was 3 days away. Eleanor understood now that her time for quiet observation had nearly run out, and that whatever she chose to do with what she had learned, she would have to decide it soon, and she would have to decide it not as a servant hiding in the shadows of someone else's house, but as a mother standing at the edge of her son's entire future. Eleanor left the Bennet household 2 days before the wedding, telling Mrs. Dawson only that a family matter required her sudden departure, an explanation vague enough to raise no questions and specific enough to satisfy propriety. Grace hugged her goodbye with genuine warmth, and Ruth pressed a small parcel of bread and cheese into her hands for the journey, and Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she was oddly moved by the kindness of 2 women who had known her for less than 2 weeks under a name that was not even her own. The journey to Nathaniel's estate took the better part of a day, and Eleanor spent every mile of it composing and recomposing what she meant to say, discarding one approach after another as either too harsh or too soft, too likely to sound like an old woman's meddling, or too gentle to convey the seriousness of what she had witnessed. By the time the carriage rolled through the familiar gates of her son's estate, gates she had passed through thousands of times over the decades, she still had not settled on the right words, and found herself grateful, in a strange way, that the uncertainty at least kept her mind occupied, and away from the sheer exhaustion pulling at every limb. The staff at the front door stared openly as she climbed down from the carriage, still dressed as Ellen Marsh, a housemaid's plain wool gown hanging oddly on a woman whose bearing, even in servant's clothes, had never quite lost its lifetime of ducal posture. She traveled straight to Nathaniel's estate, arriving still in her plain gray servant's dress, her hands roughened from a fortnight of honest labor, and demanded to see her son the moment the front door opened to receive her. Nathaniel found her in the small drawing room, and his face went through an entire sequence of confusion before settling on alarm. "Mother, what on earth are you wearing? Why do you look like you've walked here from Surrey on foot?" "Sit down, Nathaniel. I have a great deal to tell you, and very little time before your wedding to tell it." He sat, though his expression remained wary, and Eleanor told him everything. She told him about the letter that had worried her, the single line about Charlotte that had felt more like a title than a description of love. She told him about the disguise, the fortnight spent scrubbing floors and pressing linens under the name Ellen Marsh. She told him about the small cruelties, Peter's dismissal, the credit stolen from Grace's flower arrangement, the coldness that lived so easily behind Charlotte's warmest smiles. And then, because fairness demanded it even when it complicated the story she might have preferred to tell, she told him about the coin slipped to the gardener, the letter to Charlotte's sister full of genuine warmth, the conversation about a mother's cruel teaching, and the raw, unguarded moment when Charlotte had asked a housemaid whether she was a good person and truly wanted an honest answer. Nathaniel sat in silence for a long while after she finished, his hands clasped tightly together, his jaw working as he turned everything over. "You disguised yourself as a servant, in my bride's own household, for 2 weeks. Yes, Mother, do you understand what would have happened if she had recognized you? The scandal alone could have. I understand precisely what I risked, Nathaniel, and I would do it again tomorrow, because I needed to know the truth before you married her, and there was no other way to learn it that would not have simply shown me a performance." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her eyes searched her son's face with real anxiety, uncertain how he would receive what she had done, uncertain whether he would see it as protection or betrayal. He rose and paced the length of the room twice before speaking again, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture so exactly like his late father's that Eleanor's heart ached to see it. "I trusted her, Mother. I trusted my own judgment of her character, built over months of courtship, dozens of conversations, letters exchanged nearly every week. And you are telling me that judgment was built on sand, that I never truly saw the woman underneath the one she presented to me." I am telling you no such thing, Nathaniel, and I would ask you to actually hear what I have said, rather than the version of it your alarm is constructing. I did not say she is a fraud. I said she is complicated, as every person of real substance eventually proves to be, once you look closely enough and long enough to see past the first impression. And what is the truth then? Nathaniel asked quietly. You've told me a dozen contradictions. Which one am I meant to believe? All of them, Nathaniel. That is precisely the truth. She is capable of real cruelty, the kind that costs a good boy his position over 4 innocent minutes, and I will not pretend that away for you, whatever her reasons. But she is also capable of real kindness, the kind she cannot even bring herself to fully believe in, because she was taught from childhood that kindness is a weakness the world will punish her for showing. She is not a monster, and she is not a saint. She is a frightened young woman who has spent years building walls to protect herself from a world that showed her very little mercy, and she does not yet know how to lower them, even when she wants to. Nathaniel stood and walked to the window, much as his mother had done in her own study weeks before, and stared out at nothing in particular for a long time. What would you have me do? Call off the wedding 2 days before it happens, over a footman's dismissal and a handful of overheard conversations? I would have you do nothing rash, and nothing I have not already thought through carefully. I would have you go to her, Nathaniel, and tell her plainly what I have told you, not to shame her, not to punish her, but because she deserves to know that someone finally saw the whole of her, the cruelty and the kindness both, and chose to speak honestly rather than simply accepting the performance. And then I would have you ask her, directly, whether she is prepared to become someone better than the fear that raised her, because that fear will only calcify into something harder and colder, if it is never named and never challenged. And if she cannot, if the cruelty is simply who she is, and the kindness only ever a rare exception, then you will know it clearly, before a wedding ring makes the knowing far more costly than it needs to be. But Nathaniel, I do not believe that is what you will find. I watched her ask a housemaid, with real fear in her voice, whether she was a good person. Women who do not care for the answer do not ask that question of anyone, let alone someone with nothing to offer them in return. Nathaniel left for Surrey within the hour, still in his traveling clothes, refusing his mother's suggestion that he wait until morning. Eleanor did not go with him. This part of the story, she understood, belonged to her son and to Charlotte alone, and no amount of maternal interference could or should carry it forward from here. He returned 2 days later, on the very morning the wedding had been scheduled to take place, and Eleanor met him in the same small drawing room, her heart in her throat as she searched his face for some sign of what had happened. The wedding did not happen today, he said, and Eleanor's stomach dropped, certain for one terrible moment that she had cost her son the marriage entirely, that her interference had unraveled everything. But then Nathaniel continued, and a tired, genuine smile broke across his face. We postponed it. 6 weeks. Charlotte asked for the time herself, once I'd told her everything you told me. He described the scene for his mother in careful detail, how he had arrived at the Bennet house unannounced the morning after leaving Ashcombe, how Mrs. Prescott had nearly refused to let him see Charlotte alone given the impropriety so close to the wedding, and how Charlotte herself had overheard the commotion and insisted, against her aunt's objections, on speaking with him privately in the same small sitting room where Eleanor had once overheard her confess her fears to Mrs. Prescott. He had told her everything, plainly, and without softening it. The housemaid Ellen, who had never truly existed, the fortnight of quiet observation, every incident his mother had witnessed, and every contradiction she had struggled to reconcile. She went very pale, Nathaniel said, and very quiet. I thought for a moment she might simply order me from the house and call the whole engagement off herself, before I'd even finished explaining. But she didn't. She sat with it a long while, and then she asked me, quite steadily, whether I had come to end things, or to understand them. She wasn't angry at the disguise, at being watched. She was angry at first, understandably. Furious, actually, for the better part of an hour. But then she asked me one question that I couldn't answer, and it seemed to settle something in her. Nathaniel sat down across from his mother, his expression growing more serious. She asked whether I would have believed any of it if it had simply been reported to me second-hand, without you having witnessed it yourself, living beside her, unable to be fooled by a single performed afternoon. And I had to admit that I probably would not have. I would have assumed jealousy, or misunderstanding, or servants exaggerating for their own reasons. I needed to hear it from someone who had truly seen her, not just heard rumors about her. And the 6 weeks? She asked for them herself. Time to write Peter a proper reference and see him placed in a good position, which she's already done, by the way. He starts at Lord Ashby's estate next month. Time to speak honestly with her aunt about the way she was raised, to guard her kindness, like a miser guards coin. Time, she said, to find out whether she could actually become the person she wants to be, rather than simply promising me she already was that person on our wedding day, and hoping the promise would somehow make it true. Nathaniel's eyes met his mother's, and there was something new in them, a steadiness that had not quite been there before. She thanked me, oddly enough, for telling her the truth instead of simply calling off the engagement quietly and letting her wonder why for the rest of her life. She said no one had ever cared enough about who she truly was to bother confronting her with it directly. Everyone else had either flattered her or avoided her entirely. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the moment she'd first read her son's letter, 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. And you, Nathaniel, what do you believe, now that you've heard it all? I believe I fell in love with a woman I only half knew, same as most men do, I suspect, though I don't imagine most men's mothers go quite so far to correct the gap in their knowledge. He allowed himself a small laugh, and then sobered again. I believe she can become someone better than her fear, if given the chance and the honesty to do it properly. And I believe, Mother, however unconventional your methods, that you gave both of us exactly the chance we needed, at exactly the moment we needed it. The 6 weeks that followed passed differently than Eleanor had expected. She had imagined, perhaps, a dramatic transformation, some visible sign that Charlotte had shed her old fears entirely and emerged wholly new on the other side. Instead, the change came slowly, in small and ordinary ways that Eleanor only heard about secondhand through Nathaniel's letters, which grew longer and warmer as the weeks passed. Charlotte had begun spending afternoons with the tenant families on her aunt's small remaining property, learning their names and their troubles firsthand, rather than through the filtered reports of a steward. She had written to her sister again, not with vague promises this time, but with concrete plans, a proper season arranged for the following spring, gowns already being fitted. She had, Nathaniel wrote with evident wonder, apologized to her aunt's own housekeeper for a sharp word spoken in frustration, an apology offered without being asked for and accepted with visible surprise. Eleanor read each letter carefully, allowing herself cautious hope rather than certainty, understanding that 6 weeks was a brief span against a lifetime of learned habits, and that the true test would come not in the courtship's remaining days but in the long, ordinary years of marriage that would follow, when no dramatic revelation stood ready to prompt reflection, only the slow accumulation of small choices made or avoided, day after ordinary day. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a bright autumn morning, and Eleanor stood in the front pew this time as herself, in her finest silk rather than servant's wool, watching Charlotte walk down the aisle toward her son, with a steadiness in her posture that had not been there before, a warmth in her expression that no longer flickered on and off like a candle in wind. Peter attended too, given leave from his new position to witness the wedding of the woman who had once dismissed him, and had since made every effort to set that wrong right, standing near the back with an expression of quiet, complicated gratitude. After the ceremony, as the guests mingled in the autumn sunshine, Charlotte found Eleanor near the edge of the garden and took both her hands in her own. I owe you an apology, Your Grace, and a thanks in equal measure, though I confess I still don't quite know how to offer either properly to a duchess who once carried my breakfast tray. You owe me nothing, Charlotte. I came into your house uninvited and judged you before you had any chance to defend yourself. If anyone owes an apology, it is I. Peter approached them a few minutes later, having worked up the courage after watching from a distance, and bowed properly before Charlotte, his cap in his hands much as it had been the day he departed the Bennet house in disgrace. I wanted to thank you myself, Your Grace, for the reference. Lord Ashby's been a fair master, and I've a proper position now, better than what I had before, if I'm honest. Charlotte's composure wavered for just a moment, something bright and grateful passing across her face. You owe me no thanks, Peter. I owe you an apology I should have offered in person long before now. I am glad the reference found its way to good use. No hard feelings, Your Grace, truly. Everyone's allowed one mistake, so long as they said it right after. He bowed again and moved off to rejoin the other well-wishers, and Charlotte watched him go with an expression Eleanor recognized, the particular relief of a debt finally settled. Perhaps we're simply even then. Charlotte's smile was different now, Eleanor noticed, steadier, with nothing performed about it. I meant what I told Nathaniel. No one had ever cared enough to truly look at me before, cruelty and kindness both, and tell me honestly what they saw. I spent years being either flattered or dismissed, and I never once had to actually face myself. You gave me that, however strange the manner of the giving. Eleanor squeezed her new daughter's hands warmly. Then perhaps that fortnight scrubbing floors was worth every aching bone it cost me. Welcome to the family, Charlotte. I have a feeling you are going to make a very fine Duchess indeed, precisely because you were willing to become one honestly, rather than simply pretending to be one from the very start. Alice, upon Eleanor's return from Surrey all those months before, had taken one look at her mistress's ruined hands and burst into a fit of scolding that lasted the better part of an hour, threatening to write to the family physician about the state of her knuckles before finally relenting into simple relief that Eleanor had returned safely at all. "You are never to do such a thing again, Your Grace," Alice had said firmly, applying salve to Eleanor's palms with more force than strictly necessary. "Whatever you learned, I hope it was worth a fortnight of this." "It was worth a great deal more than that," Eleanor had answered, and meant it entirely, though it took several more weeks before the last of the roughness finally left her hands. In the months that followed the wedding, the household at Ashcombe settled into a rhythm no one, least of all Eleanor, could have fully predicted. Charlotte took to her new position with a seriousness that surprised even Nathaniel, spending long hours learning the running of the estate not from a place of performance but from genuine curiosity, asking questions of the housekeeper and the steward that showed real interest in the people whose lives her decisions would shape. She wrote to Peter twice that first year, simple letters asking after his health and his position, and when his mother fell ill and the family struggled to cover a physician's fees, Charlotte quietly saw to it that the bill was settled, asking nothing in return and requesting that Peter never learn precisely where the help had come from. Eleanor learned of it only by accident, through a conversation with the estate steward who managed such arrangements, and she said nothing to Charlotte about her discovery, understanding instinctively that some kindnesses were meant to remain unspoken, their value diminished by acknowledgement. Grace and Ruth, the two maids who had shared a narrow room with a disguised Duchess for a fortnight, received letters from Eleanor a few months after the wedding, along with generous references and, in Ruth's case, a small pension that allowed her to finally rest her aching knees in a cottage of her own, rather than working service into her final years. Neither woman ever learned the full truth of who Ellen Marsh had really been, though Ruth, in her reply, wrote that she had always suspected there was more to the quiet new girl than met the eye, and wished her every happiness in whatever life she had returned to. Grace's letter back was longer and more animated, full of news about her own life, a young farmer courting her with earnest determination, a new position she had taken at a smaller but kinder household nearer her family. She wrote that she often thought of the strange fortnight when a woman named Ellen had briefly shared her room and her worries, and that something about those quiet conversations, though she could not quite say what, had given her the courage to speak up for herself more often afterward, to ask for fair treatment rather than simply enduring whatever came. Eleanor read the letter twice, moved unexpectedly by the notion that her disguise had left small, unintended marks of good even where she had never meant to leave any at all. Charlotte's relationship with her aunt grew more honest as well, though not without difficulty. There were hard conversations in that first year, conversations about the lessons a frightened mother had passed down to a frightened daughter, about guarding kindness like scarce coin, about the cost such teachings extracted from everyone who came within their reach. Mrs. Prescott did not change easily or completely, old habits rarely do, but she softened in small, visible ways, and Charlotte found herself able to forgive the woman who had raised her, without excusing the harm those lessons had caused along the way. There was one particularly difficult evening, some 4 months into the marriage, when a letter arrived from Charlotte's own mother, still living in reduced circumstances in a distant county, containing a request for money framed in language that made plain the old family habit of treating affection and obligation as the same coin. Charlotte had wept over that letter for the better part of an evening, torn between the daughter she had once been and the woman she was trying to become, and it was Nathaniel, not Eleanor, who sat with her through the worst of it, simply present and steady, asking nothing of her except that she decide for herself what kind of daughter and what kind of Duchess she wished to be. She sent the money, in the end, but she wrote back as well, gently and honestly, setting a boundary her mother had never taught her existed, that generosity given from love was welcome, but generosity extracted through guilt would no longer be so easily won. It was, Nathaniel told his mother afterward, the proudest he had felt of his wife since the day he married her. Nathaniel and Charlotte's marriage was not perfect, no marriage built by two imperfect people ever could be, but it was honest in a way few society marriages managed to become. When old habits resurfaced, a sharp word to a servant, a flash of the cold calculation that fear had once taught her, Charlotte caught herself more quickly each time, sometimes even apologizing on the spot, a gesture that would have been unthinkable to the young woman Eleanor had first watched dismiss a footman over 4 innocent minutes. Eleanor, for her part, never regretted the fortnight she had spent as a housemaid, though her back complained about the thin mattress for months afterward, and Alice never quite stopped teasing her gently about the state of her hands upon returning, roughened and reddened from labor a duchess had no earthly business performing. But she had learned something in that narrow servants' corridor that no drawing-room conversation could ever have taught her, that people were rarely simple, that cruelty and kindness could live inside the very same heart without canceling each other out, and that the truest test of a person's character was not what they showed to those who could reward them, but what they revealed to those who could not. A year after the wedding, on a quiet evening when the whole family had gathered for supper, Charlotte took Eleanor aside in the hallway and pressed something small into her hand. It was a plain silver coin, worn smooth with age. "Do you recognize it?" Charlotte asked. Eleanor turned it over in her fingers and shook her head. "It's the coin my mother gave me when I was 12 years old, the day she taught me to guard my kindness like something precious and rare. I kept it for years as a kind of reminder. Spend carefully. Trust no one who cannot repay you. I want you to have it now, Your Grace, not as a reminder of that lesson, but as proof that I've finally let it go." Charlotte's eyes were bright, but her voice was steady, warm and unguarded in a way that no longer flickered or faded depending on who stood before her. "You saw me when I didn't want to be seen, and instead of turning away, you stayed long enough to see all of it, the good and the bad both. I don't think I would have found my way out from under that old lesson without knowing someone had looked that closely and chosen to believe I could still change." Eleanor closed her fingers gently around the small coin, feeling its worn edges against her palm, and found herself unexpectedly moved to silence for a long moment. "I did not choose to believe it easily, Charlotte. You earned that belief yourself, every single day since, through choices no one forced you to make, and no one but you could have made." Down the hallway, laughter drifted from the dining room, Nathaniel's voice rising warm and easy above the others, and somewhere beneath it, unmistakably, Charlotte's own laugh joining in, no longer measured or performed for any watching audience, simply glad, simply real. Eleanor slipped the coin into her pocket and walked back toward the sound of her family, carrying with her the quiet, hard-won knowledge that the truth she had gone looking for in a stranger's servants' quarters had turned out to be worth every aching hour it cost her to find, not because it had confirmed her fears, but because it had ultimately proven them wrong in the way that mattered most. That night, once the supper had ended and the house had settled into its late quiet, Eleanor sat alone by her fire and took the worn silver coin from her pocket, turning it over slowly in the firelight. She thought of the young woman who had once guarded this small piece of metal as a private symbol of every hard lesson her mother had taught her, and of the woman that same girl had since become, one capable of surrendering the symbol entirely because she no longer needed its warning to guide her. She thought, too, of her own life, of the many years spent believing that a duchess's worth lay chiefly in her judgment, her ability to weigh a person quickly and correctly from a comfortable distance. The fortnight spent as Ellen Marsh had taught her something humbler and truer, that real judgment required nearness, patience, and a willingness to be surprised, to hold two contradictory truths about a person at once without rushing to resolve them into something simpler than they actually were. It was not a lesson she had expected to learn so late in her life, and she found herself grateful for it in a way that surprised her, an old woman still capable of being taught something new by a frightened young bride and a fortnight of scrubbed floors. She placed the coin carefully in a small wooden box on her writing desk, alongside a few other keepsakes gathered over a long lifetime, a lock of Nathaniel's hair from his first haircut, a pressed flower from her own wedding day, a button from her late husband's favorite coat. It seemed a fitting place for it, she thought, a reminder kept not out of sorrow but out of quiet pride, proof that even the deepest fears, carried carefully enough and confronted honestly enough, could eventually be set down and released. Outside her window, the autumn night had settled fully over the estate, and somewhere in the house behind her, her son and his wife were building, slowly and imperfectly, the kind of marriage Eleanor had once feared might never be possible between them. She banked the fire, closed the small wooden box, and allowed herself, for the first time since reading that troubling letter weeks before the wedding, to rest entirely easy.